You recently joined a lot of other academics. You signed a letter demanding that elite institutions and universities stop accepting money from fossil fuel companies. Is that correct?
This is correct.
You consider Tulane an elite university?
I would like to think that we have a high standard of excellence in our education and our research.
Okay. Well, the Murphy family of Murphy Oil and the Deming family of Murphy Oil have recently given Tulane $25 million. You think, have you called on Tulane to give that money back?
Well, it's not, they didn't give that money to my unit or the department or school that I work
Have you called on Tulane to give that money back, or you think that's okay for them to keep it?
It's their prerogative, not mine.
Okay. But yet you just signed a letter saying that all elite universities should refuse fossil fuel money. Did you put a footnote in there and say, except my own?
Well, what I'd like to say, Senator, is that I believe it raises a conflict of interest for those that research climate change that are supported by the fossil fuel
Yeah,
industry.
but then why don't you ask Tulane to give the $25 million back?
Well, I think in the context, if that money were to be used to support climate research, information, disinformation, whatever it may be, then that may be an appropriate conflict of interest. But I think in the context of
You don't see the hypocrisy here?
it is hypocrisy in those that may read and
Dr. Keenan, please proceed.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. In my remarks today, I'd like to outline how climate-attributed physical impacts impose increasingly burdensome financial, capital, and operational costs for taxpayers, consumers, and infrastructure providers. The United States is facing increased electricity production costs in the order of $50 billion a year by 2050. This figure does include increased costs for cooling buildings, charging cars, increased demand for water recycling, pumping drinking water farther distances, water desalination, and increased agricultural irrigation. Additional costs for extreme weather like hurricanes and wildfires are among a wide variety of direct costs that will continue to be passed on to utility ratepayers. As a resident of New Orleans, my own electric utility only a few years ago just removed a billed surcharge for post-Hurricane Katrina 13 years after the fact. In the transportation sector, physical impacts have been widely observed for everything from extreme heat waves to flood events compromising roads, tarmacs, and rail lines, as well as pipelines. Annual direct damages for roads and rail impacts are estimated to be just under $20 billion a year by 2050. Increased operation and maintenance expenses for paving and resurfacing of roads is estimated to be approximately $19 billion at the end of this decade, a year. None of these cost estimates and projections account for the indirect costs for increased logistic costs, fuel costs, delay costs, and lost economic output. For instance, when the water is too high or too low on the Mississippi River, boat traffic delays have ripple effects in domestic and international food and grain markets. Within the water and wastewater sectors, annualized urban drainage infrastructure damages are estimated to be approximately $4 billion by 2050, with an additional $2 billion in costs associated with impairments to existing potable water systems. This latter figure does not account for the untold cost of adaptations to address water scarcity challenges facing the western United States, where with reduced irrigation, additional groundwater mining, and increased reservoir storage capacity posing significant additional costs. Most importantly, infrastructure is getting more expensive because the municipal bond market is beginning to price climate risk. When infrastructure providers issue general obligation bonds, investors are concerned that a degraded tax base may impact the fiscal stability of the issuer over the term of the bond. This default risk is amplified for revenue bonds. For instance, if a toll road is washed out in the event of a climate event, then the payment of that bond may be compromised for as long as those tolls are not being paid. Recent research has highlighted that after disasters, local governments are more likely to issue these revenue bonds, and that post-disaster issuances are paying higher comparative yields. Increases in capital costs may also be attributed to increased construction costs for incorporating engineering resilience within assets. For instance, a flood mitigation system may have to build a higher levee with greater pumping capacity to accommodate future projected precipitation, storm surge, and sea level rise design standards. Operations and maintenance costs, O&M, from climate impacts are perhaps one of the most immediate cost burdens for infrastructure providers. Additional costs for things like greater energy expenses for pumping stormwater, more stormwater, that is, are all drags on the financial balance sheet of providers and increasingly cost-burden ratepayers. Unfortunately, the United States is grossly behind in the codification of climate-sensitive design and engineering standards and on the life cycle cost accounting for evaluating the total cost of climate impairments over the useful life of these assets. As this country embarks on a new era of infrastructure investment, we have to ask ourselves some difficult questions. Are we designing today's infrastructure to handle tomorrow's load and tomorrow's environmental demand? In high-risk zones, that is high-risk impact zones, where will we invest and where will we disinvest in infrastructure? And finally, are we accounting and budgeting for the anticipated increased costs and operational expenses? Proper fiscal stewardship in the face of climate impacts will require stakeholders to work together to provide transparency and accountability. A failure to recognize and account for these costs will not only undermine our reliability of our infrastructure, it will undermine our global economic competitiveness. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Governor. Professor Keenan, you teach at Tulane?
Yes, sir, I do. I have that privilege.
And you have your own website, KeenanClimate.com, is that right?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. And you describe yourself on your website as a globally recognized thought leader. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you give paid speeches, do you?
On occasion, I do.
You have your own agent, I believe, according to your website, Lee Bureau.
This is correct.
And how much do you charge per speech?
It varies depending on the audience, the amount of preparation work that goes, and the amount of follow-through. Usually,
The last paid speech you gave, how much did you receive?
I'm happy to follow up on it.
You don't remember?
I do not.
Do you give that money to Tulane?
I do not.
You keep it?
Yes, this is outside of my capacity as a professor,
Right.
as is
Now,
standard course.
you recently sent a letter you recently joined a lot of other academics. You signed a letter demanding that elite institutions and universities stop accepting money from fossil fuel companies. Is that correct?
This is correct.
You consider Tulane an elite university?
I would like to think that we have a high standard of excellence in our education and our research.
Okay. Well, the Murphy family of Murphy Oil and the Deming family of Murphy Oil have recently given Tulane $25 million. Have you called on Tulane to give that money back?
Well, it's not, they didn't give that money to my unit or the department or school that I work
Have you
in.
called on Tulane to give that money back, or you think that's okay for them to keep it?
It's their prerogative, not mine.
Okay. But yet you just signed a letter saying that all elite universities should refuse fossil fuel money. Did you put a footnote in there and say, except my own?
Well, what I'd like to say, Senator, is that I believe it raises a conflict of interest for those that research climate change that are supported by the fossil fuel
Yeah,
industry.
but then why don't you ask Tulane to give the $25 million back?
Well, I think in the context, if that money were to be used to support climate research, information, disinformation, or whatever it may be, then that may be an appropriate conflict of interest. But I think in the context in which
You don't see the
the
hypocrisy here?
it is a hypocrisy in those that may read and interpret it as such. I see
Maybe it's like Washington. If there weren't double standards, there wouldn't be standards at all. Let me ask you this. You also participated in another article here criticizing Houston for building new buildings and McMansions. And you said, I'm going to read your quote. I don't want to misquote you, Professor. That means we have to change our consumer preferences. You could have a super efficient, energy efficient mega mansion in Houston or the suburbs, but it's still a mansion. You're still over-consuming space. Did you say that?
Yes, sir. That's based on work as a member of the IPCC. Our research suggested that reducing our footprint in terms of total spatial footprint would have significant impacts on the decarbonization of the built environment.
And so you're saying that people should live in smaller houses because larger houses contribute to CO2 emissions?
100%, Senator.
Okay. Well, recently, Tulane finished the Commons. It was 77,000 square feet, $55 million. Recently, Tulane finished the Gold Ring Woldenberg Business Complex, $35 million to complete, 92,000 square feet. Boy, that's a McMansion. Musafir Hall, 23,000 square feet. Paul Hall, 36,000 square feet. Richardson Hall, 50,000 square feet. Housing redevelopment phase 1, 230,000 square feet at Tulane. Have you called upon Tulane to stop these buildings?
Sir, the habitable space within those units are roughly the size of the conference room back there and are indeed quite small.
But they contribute to, does...
Everything that we do,
does
sir,
the
contributes.
Commons contribute more to climate change than a McMansion in Houston? You were pretty quick to criticize the people of Houston for wanting to build, you thought, McMansions, but you don't criticize your own university?
I don't find that to be equivocal comparison between space meant for students who must reside at a university.
You don't see
and
the
those that-
hypocrisy in that?
It is your finding and interpretation, sir.
But you don't see the irony of the hypocrisy?
I'm going to go ahead and say no.
Okay. I kind of gathered that would be your answer. Governor, good to see you. You live in a big house, don't you?
Currently, I do, yes.
How big is the governor's mansion?
I don't know the square footage, but it's large, and it's 60 years old this year. You ought to come by and
I
see-
need to
see
get
the
by.
work.
Well, the professor from Tulane doesn't like that. Let me ask you,